Welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Always a pleasure.
Today, we're going to be tackling some real fundamental economic concepts.
Yeah,
We're looking at demand,
right.
externalities,
Right.
and economic growth, and you have given us quite a range of sources this time.
It's going to be a challenge.
It is a buffet of learning materials.
That's right.
We've got textbook excerpts, videos, blog posts, even some slideshows.
It is a smorgasbord.
It's a smorgasbord. It is so...
Looking forward to it.
We're going to do our best to kind of tie all these different perspectives together for you today.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about economics is how much it really impacts our everyday lives without us even realizing it.
Oh, absolutely. Like, we all want things, right? We
Yeah.
want that new phone or a vacation or, that extra large coffee in the morning. But
Right.
when we talk about demand in economics, it's a little more specific, isn't it?
It is. It is. And Huey Erntan's notes on this are really clear.
Mm-hmm.
Demand is the willingness and ability of an individual to purchase goods or services. So
Yeah.
it's not just about wanting that new phone.
Right.
It's about wanting it and being able to pay for it.
So desire plus the ability to pay.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we have this thing called the law of demand. And Jacob Clifford, in his video, explains this using a gallon of milk.
Yes.
And he's saying that as the price of something drops, people are willing to buy more of it.
Makes sense. It's all about the incentives, right? A lower price makes something more appealing.
Right.
But Clifford very smartly points out that economists use this phrase, ceteris paribus, when they're talking about the law of demand.
Ceteris paribus.
It's Latin.
It sounds very fancy.
It makes us sound smart.
Okay.
But all it means is all other things being equal or all other things remaining the same.
Okay.
So in other words,
Okay.
when we talk about the relationship between price and quantity demanded, we're assuming everything else that could impact demand is staying constant.
They're isolating it. Exactly.
We want to make sure we're comparing apples to apples.
Okay, so we're isolating the impact of the price change to see how that one variable affects things.
Exactly.
Got it. And that's how we get that classic downward sloping demand curve.
Right.
At lower prices, people buy more. At higher prices, they buy less.
Precisely. And Clifford uses that example with the milk, which I think is so memorable.
Yeah.
Remember, he talks about how the first sip of milk is the best, and then every additional sip you take after that, you
Right.
get a little bit less satisfaction.
Yeah, it's like the first bite of a really good meal.
Exactly.
It's the best one, right?
Yeah, it's like that with everything.
Yeah, and then as you get more and more full, you just don't enjoy it as much.
The excitement wanes a little bit, and economists have a name for this.
They do.
Yeah, it's called the law of diminishing marginal utility.
Wow.
I know, isn't that a mouthful? But
It is.
it basically means that each additional unit of a good we consume gives us less and less additional satisfaction.
So like that third slice of pizza just doesn't hit the same.
Exactly, exactly. And I think businesses understand this really well, right? Because they exploit the law of demand all the time.
How so?
Well, think about sales and discounts. They're lowering the price of a good
Right.
to encourage us to buy more, and it works because that lower price makes each additional unit seem more worthwhile, even if we're getting a little bit less satisfaction from it.
Right. It's all about getting that bang for your buck.
Exactly.
I like that. So a change in price moves us along the demand curve.
Yes.
But what about all those other things that can influence demand?
Yes.
Huiyantan calls them demand shifters in her notes.
Right. Demand shifters are all those factors besides price that can actually cause the whole demand curve to shift either to the left or to the right.
Okay.
So we're not just talking about moving along the curve now.
Right.
We're talking about the whole curve shifting.
The whole thing moving.
Exactly.
Okay.
And some examples of these demand shifters are things like changes in income changes in the prices of related goods. Even things like changes in tastes and preferences.
It's like trends coming and going, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Okay. So could you maybe give us a quick rundown of how some of these shifters actually work?
Sure, let's start with income. Let's say your income increases.
Okay.
Suddenly, you might be more willing and able to buy more of a good at every single price point.
Okay.
So that would shift the entire demand curve to the right, meaning that overall, at every single price, demand is higher.
Okay. Makes sense.
What about those related goods?
Yeah, you mentioned those.
Yeah, so there are two main types of related goods that we think about in economics.
Okay.
We have substitutes
Okay.
and we have complements.
So substitutes are goods that you can kind of use in place of each other.
Exactly. Think about Coke and Pepsi,
Classic example.
right? If the price of Coke goes up, people might start drinking more Pepsi instead.
Makes sense.
And that would shift the demand curve for Pepsi to the right.
Okay, so they're kind of competing with each other.
Exactly. And then we have those complement goods. Those are goods that tend to be consumed together. A
Okay.
classic example of this is peanut butter and jelly.
Of course, peanut butter and jelly.
Right. So if the price of peanut butter increases, the demand for jelly might actually decrease, even if the price of jelly stays the same.
Because who wants jelly without peanut butter?
Exactly.
I mean, I guess some people, but
Right.
it's not the same.
Not ideal.
So even if the price of a good hasn't changed, all these other factors can influence how much people want to buy.
Absolutely. It's a very dynamic system.
It's way more complex than just price alone.
Exactly. And sometimes this complexity leads to situations where markets don't work as smoothly as we might hope.
And that's where we get to this idea of market failure.
Dun, dun, dun.
It sounds pretty dramatic.
Well, it can be.
Okay.
So the IB notes define market failure as any time resources aren't being allocated efficiently,
Okay.
which means we're not getting the best possible outcome for society as a whole.
Okay, so it's like a mismatch
I-
between what people want or need and what's actually being produced.
Exactly, or how it's being produced.
Okay.
And there are a number of things that can cause these market mishaps.
Like what?
Well, one of the major ones is something called externalities.
Externalities.
Externalities, yeah. And these are the costs or benefits that spill over to people who aren't directly involved in a transaction.
Okay.
So it's like external to the buyer and the seller.
Okay, so like if I buy a car, there are obviously costs and benefits to me, but are you saying there might also be costs or benefits to people who weren't even part of that car buying decision?
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this gets complicated.
Right. And a classic example of this is pollution.
Mm.
Let's say we have a factory that's producing goods, but as a byproduct, it's also polluting the air or the water.
Right.
Now, that pollution might impact the health and well-being of people who live nearby,
Yeah.
even if they never bought anything from that factory.
Okay.
So that's a negative externality.
So it's like a hidden cost.
Exactly. A cost that's not reflected in the market price of the goods.
And the IB notes mention smoking as another example of a negative externality.
Right. Because of the impact it has on healthcare costs and worker productivity.
Okay.
But it's not all doom and gloom.
Oh, good.
We also have positive externalities.
Okay.
So these are the beneficial spillovers.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure, education is a great one.
Okay.
When someone gets an education, they obviously benefit directly, right?
Right. They learn new skills and knowledge.
Exactly. But society also benefits.
Okay.
We get a more productive workforce,
Okay.
a more informed citizenry.
More innovation, perhaps.
Exactly. And those benefits aren't fully captured in the private cost of education.
So again, it's like these hidden benefits.
Exactly. Benefits that the market doesn't necessarily account for.
Okay, so we've got these externalities, but positive and negative, and they're kind of like these invisible forces that are influencing the market.
That's a great way to put it. They're these invisible costs and benefits that are often not reflected in the prices of goods and services.
So the market isn't really telling us the whole story.
Exactly. It's not capturing the full impact of our choices.
This is making me rethink my shopping habits.
It's a lot to consider.
It is. So what happens when markets go awry like this?
Right. Well, that's where governments often step in.
Oh.
They try to fix the mess.
So governments are kind of like the referees of the economic game,
I like that analogy.
trying to make sure everyone's playing fair and that the overall outcome is beneficial.
Exactly. And they have a few tools at their disposal to try to do this.
Okay, like what?
Well, one of the most common tools is taxation.
Taxes?
Yep. And Saskia's blog has this great example of how Jamaica used taxes to try to reduce alcohol consumption.
Okay.
And they even include this graph that shows how the tax increases the price of alcohol, which in theory should lead to people drinking less.
Okay, so it's like they're trying to make the price of alcohol reflect the true cost to society.
Exactly. They're trying to internalize that negative externality so that drinkers bear more of the cost of their choices.
And hopefully reduce those negative consequences for everyone.
Precisely. But the IB notes also point out that the effectiveness of a tax really depends on something called price elasticity of demand.
Price elasticity of demand, what is that?
Well, it's basically how responsive people are to changes in price.
Okay.
So for some goods, like let's say cigarettes,
Okay.
which are very addictive people might not reduce their consumption that much even if the price goes up.
So the tax might not be as effective in changing their behavior.
Exactly.
Okay, so taxation has its limitations,
It does.
but it's still a pretty widely used tool, right?
It is. It's a way to discourage certain behaviors to generate revenue for governments, and ideally to make the market price more accurately reflect the true cost to society.
It's like trying to nudge people in the right direction.
Exactly.
And speaking of trying to influence behavior, another tool that governments use is regulations.
Yes.
And the IB notes give us some examples of this. They talk about banning smoking in certain areas, imposing age restrictions on gambling,
Right.
and requiring motorcyclists to wear helmets.
Yeah, regulations can be really powerful, but they're not without their challenges.
What kind of challenges?
Well, sometimes regulations can lead to unintended consequences.
Okay.
They can create black markets, or they can be really difficult to enforce.
Right, it's like that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Exactly.
Sometimes even the best intentions can lead to unexpected outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And this brings us to a really interesting point that the IB notes highlight. They call it the TOK moment.
TOK moment.
Yes, theory of knowledge.
Okay.
It's all about this challenge of balancing individual freedom with the well-being of society.
Right.
So when it comes to government intervention, it's this constant push and pull
Yeah.
between allowing people to make their own choices
Okay.
and enacting policies that promote the greater good.
Right. So where do we draw the line?
Exactly. It's a thorny issue.
It is, but it's fascinating, isn't it, how we started with this simple act of buying things?
I know.
And now we're grappling with these really complex philosophical questions about the role of government in our lives.
That's what I love about economics.
Yeah,
It's not just about numbers and graphs. It's about human behavior.
totally.
It's about choices and consequences.
Yeah.
And it's about this constant interplay between individual actions and societal outcomes.
Right, and we've only just begun.
We've only just scratched the surface.
We still need to explore those positive externalities.
Yes.
And those intriguing merit goods.
Right.
And then there's this whole other world of economic growth that we need to dive into.
I'm ready for the next leg of our journey.
Me too. Let's see what other insights we can uncover.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've explored demand and those tricky externalities, but now
Yeah.
let's talk about those merit goods you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
What makes those so special?
Well, the IB notes describe merit goods as goods that have positive externalities.
Okay.
So they benefit society as a whole, even beyond the people who are directly consuming them.
So it's kind of like a ripple effect
Exactly.
of good stuff.
Exactly. And a good example of this would be like vaccinations. So when you get vaccinated, you're obviously protecting yourself,
Right.
but you're also reducing the spread of disease, which helps everyone.
Right, so there's like a public benefit there.
Exactly.
Okay, but you said earlier that the market sometimes underproduces these merit goods.
It does.
Why is that?
Well, if you think about it, if we just left everything up to the free market,
Okay.
we might not end up with enough education or health care or even those life-saving vaccines
Okay.
because the market's really focused on private benefits.
Right, just the individual.
Right. It's not necessarily taking into account those broader societal benefits.
So if we left it all up to the market, we might end up with less education healthcare vaccinations
Potentially, yeah.
than what's actually best for society as a whole.
Right. And economists would say that society would actually prefer a higher quantity of these merit goods than what the free market would naturally provide.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so this is where governments often step in. They recognize those positive spillover effects of these merit goods, and they try to encourage their consumption.
Okay, so how do they do that? How do they nudge people towards these good choices?
Well, one common tool is subsidies.
Okay,
So governments might make education more affordable,
right.
healthcare more affordable.
Like government-funded schools
Exactly.
or healthcare programs.
Exactly. And this incentivizes people to consume more of those merit goods.
Right. It's about making them accessible to
Exactly.
more people.
Right. And let's not forget about the power of information and advertising.
Right.
So do you know those public awareness campaigns you see?
Yeah.
Promoting healthy eating habits or encouraging vaccinations?
Yeah, those catchy jingles.
There
They
you
get
go.
stuck in your head.
Well, governments use those to try to influence people's preferences,
Oh, okay.
to make choices that benefit not just themselves, but society as a whole.
Right. It's all about those positive spillover effects.
Exactly.
It makes you really appreciate those government-funded programs
Yeah.
and public services that we often take for granted.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that collective action through government can sometimes lead to better outcomes than just relying solely on individual choices in the market.
Okay, so we've covered demand externalities,
We have.
merit goods.
Yes.
Now let's shift gears to another big player in the economic game,
Yeah.
economic growth.
Yes.
What exactly is economic growth?
Well, essentially, economic growth is an increase in production of goods and services over time.
Okay.
And it's often seen as a key indicator of a nation's overall well-being.
Okay, so why is economic growth seen as such a good thing?
Well, a couple reasons. One is that it can lead to higher living standards for citizens.
Okay.
It often means more job opportunities,
Okay.
increased incomes, and greater access to all those goods and services that we want.
Right.
And plus, it usually means more tax revenue for governments,
Okay.
which allows them to fund those public services that we were just talking about.
Right, so it's kind of like a virtuous cycle?
It can be.
Okay, so that makes sense. But how do we actually measure this economic growth? How do we know if an economy is actually growing?
Right. Well, the IGCSE economic slides emphasize the importance of using something called real GDP as our measure of economic growth.
Okay, real GDP. What's that all about?
So real GDP takes inflation into account.
Okay.
So it gives us a more accurate picture of actual changes in production.
So it's not just about the total value of goods and services produced,
Right.
but about how that value is changing over time,
Exactly.
taking into account that things are generally getting more expensive.
Precisely. And economists also look at per capita GDP.
Per capita.
Per capita,
Okay.
which is just real GDP divided by the population.
Okay.
And this tells us how growth is being distributed across the population.
Okay.
So it's not just about the size of the economic pie.
Right.
It's about how those slices are being divided.
Okay, because even if an economy is growing,
Yes.
if those benefits aren't being shared equally,
Exactly.
it's not really progress for everyone.
Right. It's not necessarily improving everyone's standard of living.
Okay, so it's important to look at both the overall growth and how it's being distributed.
Exactly. And it's also important to note that economic growth doesn't always follow a smooth upward trajectory.
Okay.
It tends to follow the cyclical pattern,
Okay.
kind of like a roller coaster,
Okay.
with periods of rapid growth followed by periods of slowdown or even contraction.
So like a boom and bust cycle.
Exactly. And this is where Jacob Clifford's analogy about the changing seasons comes in.
Okay.
Remember, he uses the market for sun balm as an example.
Right.
So in the summer, demand for sun balm is high.
Right. Everyone's at the beach.
Exactly. But come winter.
Nobody wants that stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nobody's buying sun balm in the winter.
It's like that with all sorts of products, though, right?
It is.
Like swimsuits and snow shovels and holiday decorations.
Exactly. Demand fluctuates throughout the year.
Yeah.
And those fluctuations in demand actually mirror those ups and downs of the business cycle. So sometimes the economy's booming, sometimes it's in a slump.
Just like the seasons.
Exactly.
So what drives those economic booms and busts? What factors are influencing these upswings and downswings in the economy?
Right. Well, there are a lot of factors at play.
Okay.
Investments in physical capital are a big one.
Okay, so that's like machinery and infrastructure.
Exactly. All
No.
the stuff that we need to produce goods and services.
Right. So if businesses are investing,
Yeah.
that can boost productivity and drive growth.
Exactly. And investments in human capital are also really important.
Okay, so that's like education and training.
Exactly. Because a more educated and skilled workforce is a more productive workforce.
Right.
And of course, technological advancements play a huge role.
Right. Innovation.
Innovation.
Right.
And exactly. New technologies can totally revolutionize industries
Yeah.
and lead to these massive increases in productivity and efficiency.
So those are all things that can drive economic growth. But what happens when an economy is in a slump? What do governments do?
Well, they often try to stimulate growth with different policies.
Oh, okay.
And broadly speaking, these policies fall into two categories. We have demand-side policies,
Okay.
and we have supply-side policies.
So are they trying to kind of kickstart the economy by either boosting demand or increasing supply?
That's exactly right.
Okay, so let's break those down a little bit. What are some examples of demand-side policies?
Okay, so demand-side policies focus on increasing consumer spending.
Okay.
So things like government spending programs
Okay.
or tax cuts for individuals.
Okay, so by putting more money in people's pockets,
Exactly.
they're hoping that that will encourage them to spend more,
Right.
which then stimulates demand
Yeah.
and boosts the economy.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about those supply-side policies? How do those work?
Right. So supply-side policies aim to increase the productive capacity of the economy.
Okay.
So some common examples of this include tax cuts for businesses,
Okay.
deregulation, which is reducing the burden of regulations on businesses, and investments in infrastructure to improve things like transportation and communication networks.
Okay, so it's a two-pronged approach.
It is.
Stimulate demand,
Yes,
increase supply.
exactly.
It's like giving the economy a double shot of espresso.
That's a good way to put it.
But it's important to remember that economic growth isn't a magic bullet.
Right.
It can come with its own set of challenges.
It does.
Like what are some of those challenges?
Well, rapid economic growth can sometimes lead to inflation,
Right.
which is that rise in prices that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, nobody likes when things get more expensive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it can also exacerbate income inequality
Okay.
if the benefits of growth aren't being shared equitably.
So economic growth doesn't automatically benefit everyone equally.
Unfortunately not.
Okay.
If the gains from growth are concentrated at the top,
Okay.
it can actually widen the gap between the rich and the poor.
Right, so it's important to make sure that everyone's benefiting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what about those environmental impacts we discussed earlier?
Yeah.
Does economic growth always come at the expense of the environment? It certainly can.
Okay.
And the IGCSE economics slides are very clear about this, that economic growth, especially if it's driven by resource-intensive industries, can lead to things like pollution,
Okay.
resource depletion, and even climate change.
Right, if it's not managed sustainably.
Exactly.
So it's like this double-edged sword.
It is.
Economic growth can bring many benefits,
It can.
but it also has the potential to harm the environment
Yes.
if we're not careful.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
all about finding that balance between economic prosperity and environmental stewardship.
Right.
It's a big challenge.
It is a challenge that we face as a global society.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the basics of demand to these complex issues
I know.
of economic growth.
Yes.
It's amazing how all these seemingly disparate concepts are actually interconnected.
Right. It's like piecing together this giant puzzle.
I like that.
And each source that we've explored has given us a new piece,
Okay.
helping us to see the bigger picture.
Right, of how the economy works.
Yeah, and how it impacts our lives in so many ways.
It's been a really insightful journey so far.
It has been.
I feel like I've learned a lot already.
Me too. And we're not done yet.
Oh.
We still have a few more economic treasures to unearth.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has.
I feel like we've been on this whirlwind tour of the whole economic landscape.
Yeah, from like these individual choices we make
Right.
to those big market forces,
Yeah.
government interventions,
Mhm.
and even like the ups and downs of entire economies.
It's a lot.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's fascinating how these economic concepts are all interconnected.
Yeah, it's like we've been weaving together this giant tapestry
Oh,
of how the world works.
I like that analogy a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get too lost in like the grand scheme of things,
Yeah.
let's take a moment to kind of recap some of the key insights that we've uncovered from these sources.
Okay.
Okay, so remember how we started with demand? Yeah.
It's not just about wanting things.
Right.
It's about the willingness and the ability to actually buy them.
Exactly.
And we learned that it's influenced by a whole bunch of factors,
Right.
not just price.
Right.
Like changes in income, the prices of related goods.
And tastes and preferences,
Yeah.
expectations about the future.
Right. All those things can cause that entire demand curve to shift,
Exactly.
impacting how much people want to buy.
Yep.
Okay. And then we kind of dove into this idea of markets and how they don't always function perfectly.
Yeah, sometimes those markets fail.
They fail.
They fail to allocate resources in the most efficient way.
Right. And that's often due to those externalities.
Right, those costs or benefits that spill over to people who aren't even involved in the transaction.
It's tricky.
It is tricky.
Okay, so we saw examples of how like pollution from factories
Yeah.
can harm nearby residents,
Yeah.
or how smoking can lead to higher healthcare costs for everybody.
Right. But we also talked about those positive externalities.
Yes.
Like how education can create a more productive workforce that benefits society as a whole.
Exactly.
And a lot of times when those market failures happen, governments will step in and try to fix the mess. Right?
They do. They try to do
Yeah, they're trying to kind of course correct.
Right, using tools like taxes and regulations.
Right. We saw the example from Saskia's blog about how Jamaica used taxes to try to reduce alcohol consumption.
Right.
We talked about how governments use subsidies
Yes.
to make merit goods like education and healthcare more affordable.
Right, trying to encourage people to make those choices
Exactly.
that are good for everyone.
And even those public awareness campaigns, right?
Oh, yeah.
They can actually nudge people
Yeah.
towards making those choices that benefit not just themselves, but society as a whole.
It's all about trying to find that balance
It is.
between individual choice and kind of the collective good.
Yeah, for sure. And then, of course, we explored economic growth.
Yes.
We learned how it's measured. Right.
Using real GDP and per capita GDP,
Right.
we talked about all those factors that drive it from investments to innovation
Yeah.
and all those potential downsides,
Right.
like inflation,
Yeah.
inequality,
Uh-huh.
and even environmental damage.
Absolutely.
It's complex.
It is.
So what does this all mean for the listener?
Right. That's the big question.
What's the takeaway here?
I think one of the key takeaways is that economics is everywhere.
Okay.
It's not just some abstract theory
Right.
confined to textbooks. It's really this lens through which we can better understand the world, how it works, how our choices, both as individuals and collectively shape our lives
Okay.
and the lives of others.
So by understanding these economic concepts, we can navigate the world a little better.
Exactly.
Make more informed decisions,
Right.
have more productive conversations about these issues. Yeah. And maybe even contribute to creating a more just and sustainable economic system for everybody.
Right. So it's not just about understanding, it's about applying what we learn.
It empowers us to not just be passive observers,
Yeah.
but to actually be active participants in shaping our economic reality.
I love that we've talked about all these different topics and the different types of taxes that governments use.
Yeah.
And it really got me thinking about fairness.
Yeah.
Like, what actually makes a tax system fair?
That is the question.
Is it one where everyone pays the same amount regardless of their income?
Right.
Or is it one where those who earn more contribute a larger share?
Right. That's a question that economists and policymakers have been wrestling with for centuries.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer.
Right.
It often comes down to values and priorities.
Okay.
You know, do we prioritize individual freedom and minimize government intervention, even if it means greater inequality?
Okay.
Or do we prioritize social welfare and use government intervention to redistribute wealth
Okay.
and create a more equitable society?
Right. So there are trade-offs.
Always trade-offs.
Always trade-offs. It's complex.
It is. It's complex, but that's what makes economics so fascinating, right?
Yeah.
It challenges us to think critically,
Right.
to question our assumptions,
Uh-huh.
to consider different perspectives,
And to keep learning.
and to keep learning.
Right. Because we've only just scratched the surface here.
We have. There's so much more to explore in this world of economics.
Absolutely. So, to our listener, we encourage you to keep that curiosity burning.
Yes.
Keep asking those thought-provoking questions
Right?
and keep diving deep.
Yeah.
You never know what insights you might uncover.
It's the beauty of it.
Until next time.
Until next time.